Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Danielle Ping. I am a sophomore here at Princeton University, and I am actually an intern for the Center for African American Studies, so I'm actually really excited to be here today. And I just wanted to thank you all for being here with us from 10:30 till now, many of you from 9 till now. And I just wanted to move us into the last portion of our program, which, as many of you know, is our keynote conversation. And I would like to introduce our two phenomenal speakers, the first of which is Dr. Cornell West. Mr. Brother. Brother. However we like to enunciate all three. Now, this amazing man uses the traditions of the Black Baptist Church, progressive politics, and his favorite, jazz, in order to develop and devote his life to championing racial and equal justice. As the class of 1943 professor at Princeton University, Professor West believes in educating the next generation of brothers and sisters, something that he demonstrates through the numerous lectures and seminars he's taught at the university. The author of 19, that's as old as I am, 19 books, most notably Race Matters, and the memoir Brother West, Living and Laughing Out Loud. Professor West describes himself as a bluesman in the life of the mind, a jazzman in the world of ideas, forever on the move. In addition to being an author, a professor, and a bluesman, Professor West is both a radio host and an activist. He appears with Tavis Smiley Weekly on Smiley and West, and he has also been a guest on the Tavis Smiley Show, as well as many other regular television occurrences. Professor West serves as an advocate for the imprisoned. He visits prison systems on more than a regular basis in order to develop relationships with inmates. In short, Professor West both talks the talk and walks the walk, serving as a moral prophet for the 21st century. Next, I would like to introduce the equally phenomenal Mrs. Professor Michelle Alexander.
Yes.
Oh, you can applaud, please. Both absolutely deserve it. As a professor at Ohio State University, Professor Alexander holds a joint appointment with the Moritz College of Law and the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Professor Alexander has won numerous awards, and I do mean numerous, and has been featured as well on the Tavis Smiley Show, NPR, and C-SPAN. She has served as director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU of Northern California, working against racial profiling by law enforcement. In 2010, Professor Alexander published her first book entitled The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, praised as an enlightening and eye-opening work. Now, I wanted to ask how many of you in this room either know of that book or have read it? Every single hand in this room is up, Professor Alexander. I'll put mine up too, by the way. And I think that shows just how much and how phenomenal and how meaningful this book is, not just to today's discussion, but to the world at large. And I would like to actually read a passage from that book because I think it relates to what we're discussing today. The passage begins, "What has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than with the language we use to justify it. In the era of color blindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you are labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunities, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are all suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. In response to the new Jim Crow, Glenn Lowry of Brown University comments, "With imprisonment now the principal instrument of our social policy directed towards poorly educated black men, Michelle Alexander argues convincingly that the huge racial disparity of punishment in America is not merely a result of neutral state action. She sees the rise of mass incarceration as opening up a new front in the historic struggle for racial justice. And she's right. If you care about justice in America, you need to read this book." So since everybody in this room has read the book, we'll do you one better and have the author here for you to conversate with. So without further ado, I would like to ask you all to join me in welcoming to the stage our two keynote speakers, Professor West and Professor Alexander.
What a blessing to be here. What a magnificent day. High quality panels, painful truths, but at the same time, I hope you also feel inspired because we are fundamentally here to ensure that those in prison are not forgotten.
Yes.
We affirm their humanity. We may hate the crime, but we love the human beings who committed the crime if they committed the crime. And being there. I am just so very, very excited to be on the same stage as the author of the classic text, The New Jim Crow. You all might recall The Strange Career of Jim Crow, written by the distinguished historian C. Van Woodward, was the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was the Black Freedom Movement trying to dismantle a Jim Crow system, a racial caste system. The New Jim Crow, written by our dear sister, Professor Michelle Alexander, is the Bible of this new movement. It's the Bible of this new movement. To do what? To dismantle the new Jim Crow, the new form of the racial caste system. Before I jump into questions, though, I want to salute my dear brother Brandon. Straight out of Compton. Growing up in Inglewood, he's a fellow Californian. But who would have thought, though, brother, when we first had the dialogue and you came in the office there with Sister Marianne and myself, that you would end up producing an unprecedented conference. Now, we thank Sister Jen and Jennifer, who's done a magnificent job for us, no leeway Rooks, and all those there, but let's just be honest, this is a student-initiated conference. Sister Danielle and the other students, but this is student-initiated. This is the best of what Princeton is all about. The quest for truth, small t. And the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, but also unapologetic love and care. And we believe justice is what love looks like in public. Just like deep democracy is what justice looks like in practice. And so we're going to highlight what is invisible, hidden, and concealed behind this prison industrial complex. And he knew there was no better person to bring than Sister Michelle Alexander. I want to begin by asking you the question of what was the motivation of the text. I know the text begins with the shift in your own mind and perception given your thought and praxis. And even given us a brief characterization of the argument for those who have not read it, or those who've read it may have forgot. And especially for all of those folk who are watching, because you got thousands of folk watching on the web and so forth and so on. We have our precious brothers and sisters in the prisons. Grateford prison. I see Brother Jim Wetzel there. Brother Albert's looking at it. Brother James looking at it. Garden State's look, Wagner's look. Trenton State Prison. All of our brothers and sisters in prison also watching. Could you characterize your argument just very briefly, and then we'll get into our exchange?
Yes, well, first I do want to thank again everyone who made this event possible. And it's extraordinary, and there's not enough conversations like this happening in the United States today. And so thank you again for not being too shy and feeling the urgency that this moment in our history represents, and walking into the office and saying, I think we need to do something and have this conversation here now. So I'm delighted to be here. And, you know, the thesis of my book is that we haven't ended racial caste in America. We've merely redesigned it. Through the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, political movements that were in response were a backlash against the civil rights movement. We have managed to recreate a caste-like system in America. Mass incarceration did not arise due to crime rates. You know, that's the popular myth that our prison population has exploded in 3 decades, you know, because of crime rates. It's not true. You know, crime rates have gone up, have gone down over the last few decades. Today are at historical lows. But, you know, incarceration rates have consistently soared. You know, most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates have soared regardless of whether crime is going up or down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So how did we get here? How did we get here if not crime rates? Well, the answer is the war on drugs, the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States that resulted in millions of people of color being permanently locked up or locked out. And I believe it will take nothing less than a major social movement to end the new Jim Crow.
So you're calling for that social movement, especially in that last chapter?
Yes, absolutely.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
I know the legendary Anna Daly is here, who has been wrestling with the prison industrial complex for the last 30 years or so, the prophetic wing of the NAACP here in New Jersey. And when she and I are together, we have discussions, and I want to raise a question about the intimate relation between the invisible hand of the so-called free market and the hard fist of the prison system, of the penal state, because there's a sense in which your subtle analysis and prophetic call, with that echo of James Baldwin in that last chapter, goes out on a high note, that it has something to do with the age of Reagan. It has something to do with unfettered markets. It has something to do with unregulated markets, greed running amok, wealth inequality, so much money is hemorrhaged at the top, indifference toward poor people, indifference toward working people, and then the politics of polarization, the politics of fear. That makes it very difficult for us to have sustained public discussions about poor people. I mean, look at even Brother Barack Obama's last State of the Union, right? No reference to poor people at all. The first State of the Union since 1948, no reference to poor people. What's going on? It's not politically feasible. Not politically feasible. In fact, folks say I hear more and more folk in the black community say Barack Obama runs from race the way a black man runs from the police. But the black man running from the police is running to get away, not get caught. He's running from race to get elected, to stay in office. But it's a culmination of the age of Reagan, where very few people, I don't care who they are, right? Black leadership doesn't really talk about the prison industrial complex. Your critique of black leaders is quite powerful, quite courageous, could get you in a lot of trouble, as you know.
I'm not scared.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that's the truth. That's the truth. You're into a whole lot of trouble. But let's say something about the free market fundamentalism that was unleashed under Reagan and the concealing of this new racial caste system that you lay bare so beautifully.
Yes, well, I think it's important for people to understand not only the political context that gave rise to mass incarceration, but the economic context.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking just about the profit motive in prisons, now that, corporations have found a way to make big money off of mass incarceration. What I'm talking about is the climate that existed in the United States as a result of deindustrialization and globalization in the 1970s heading into the 1980s. During that period of time, industrial work, disappeared in the United States. Disappeared, just vanished. Cities like Chicago, which, as late as 1970, about 70% of working age black men had some kind of industrial job in Chicago as late as 1970. By the mid-1980s, when the war on drugs was kicking off, that figure had plummeted to 27%. There was sudden, massive joblessness in urban areas across America, and no one was more affected by this sudden crisis than African American men. And we could have responded to this crisis with a wave of compassion, care, and concern, economic stimulus packages, bailout packages. We could have, responded with job training programs that would help young black men make the rough transition from, an industrial, blue-collar-based economy to a service-based economy. We could have flooded those communities with care, compassion, concern, with government intervention. But no, instead we ended welfare as we know it, we ended all forms of social support and intervention, and we declared the war on drugs. And that was deeply connected to Reagan's philosophy, and increasingly the philosophy of the so-called New Democrats, of viewing any kind of war on poverty or social interventions as being counterproductive, useless, a waste of money, but building prisons and spending billions on prisons to be the best use of taxpayer dollars. And at the same time this was going on, of course, this major shift in our economy, sudden joblessness, where black men found they were no longer needed to pick cotton in the fields or labor in factories, and were suddenly disposable and could be rounded up and warehoused in prisons. At the same time that this was going on, there was this huge backlash brewing against the civil rights movement. Numerous historians, sociologists, political scientists have now documented that the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement was part and parcel of a grand Republican Party strategy known as the Southern Strategy of using racially coded Get Tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who were anxious about, resentful of, threatened by many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. And really, who can blame them? Poor and working class whites really had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. Wealthy whites could send their kids to private schools, give their kids all the advantages that wealth had to offer, but poor and working class whites were suddenly faced with a social demotion. It was their kids who were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms for scarce jobs with this whole new group of people they've been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them. It was their kids who were going to be subject to busing orders and potentially, bused to a school they believed was inferior. And to make matters worse, affirmative action programs created the impression that poor, black folks were going to be leapfrogging over them on their way to Harvard and Yale. And this created an understandable amount of panic and anxiety among poor and working class whites who were themselves struggling for survival. And it also created this enormous political opportunity. Pollsters and political strategists found that thinly veiled promises to get tough on them through getting tough on crime, getting tough on welfare, could persuade poor and working class whites in the South to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party in droves. It was part of the calculated strategy to flip the South from blue to red, and they did. When President Reagan declared his drug war in 1982, at a time when drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise, it was before crack hit the streets and caused a media sensation. When he declared his drug war, he was attempting to make good on campaign promises, to get tough on a group of people who had been not so subtly defined on the basis of race. So we see how this major shift in our economy coincided with a political backlash against the civil rights movement to create the perfect storm. And generations of black men became political fodder and disposable, deemed unnecessary to the functioning of the U.S. economy.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we recall Reagan began his campaign in 1980 in Philadelphia, Mississippi, calling for states' rights, which is a buzzword, keeping Negroes under control. And Brother James Chaney was killed, and we've actually got Ben Chaney here, his brother. Where's Brother Ben? Where is Brother Ben? Is he here? Did he have to leave? Where is he? Just wave. He had to leave. Oh, I just gave him a hug. No, he was here the whole day. He's got his own movement, but it's important to keep in mind in terms of the history. And that was a multicultural trio, wasn't it? It was black and white brothers and sisters killed in Jim Crow gut bucket, Mississippi. Reagan, not to be demonized, he was a human being too, but we love all human beings who commit crimes. But what we're talking about is trying to set this context in such a way that even that white backlash in the name of law and order doesn't really hold when you engage in predatory lending. It doesn't hold when you're an insider trader on Wall Street. It doesn't hold when you're engaged in fraudulent activity in corporate America, where there's scandals and crimes committed over and over and over again, and you get an outside settlement. You got $30 billion profit and you pay $5 million. Tap on the hammer. Jamal gets caught with a bag of marijuana, he's gone. Maria gets caught with a bag, she's gone. So even to talk about rule of law becomes hypocritical in that sense. Or if you're a torturer, you can have tea. Or if you're a wiretapper, you can go to and sip your cognac. But no, if you're poor, you're going to live a life fearful of confinement and captivity, forever haunted by the helicopters. That's what it is to live in the zone of abandonment, the fear of neglect, the hoods of suffering of so many poor, disproportionately black and brown and red, but also white brothers and sisters poor too. That's what is so powerful about the new Jim Crow. How do you keep alive the legacy of Baldwin and Martin King and Fannie Lou Hamer and others? And that's what you've been able to do. What does one say to present day leadership in light of both the analysis, but how we try to get this movement off the ground, making our connections with our brothers and sisters behind bars and those of us who are in prison in the larger death sentence in space and time?
Well, I think we have to understand why civil rights organizations and black political leaders have been so quiet for the most part over the last few decades. You would think that given the impact of mass incarceration on poor communities of color and the devastation wrought by the war on drugs, that this would just be the number one issue for every civil rights organization, in America. And it would be at the top of the agenda for the Congressional Black Caucus and for black political leaders nationwide. The war on drugs has resulted in millions of people ushered into this permanent second-class status, destroying families. A question was asked earlier about, families and what it's meant for families. A black child born today has less of a chance of being raised by both parents than a black child born during slavery. And this is due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men. there was an excellent article that was run in The Economist magazine, of all places, entitled "How the Mass Incarceration of Black Men Harms Black Women." And in the article, it discussed the fact that the majority of black women in the United States are unmarried, including about 70% of professional black women, and that this was due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men, which takes them out of the dating pool. You know, at the years they would be most likely to commit to a partner or, you know, to a family. But then what's worse is that by branding them criminals and felons, they're rendered permanently unemployable in the legal job market for the most part, virtually guaranteeing that they'll cycle in and out of prison for the rest of their lives. You know, and this phenomenon hasn't been impacting just some small segment of the black community, you know, so that it might escape the notice or attention of major civil rights organizations. No, in major urban areas, more than half, the majority of working age African American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In the Chicago area, it was reported in 2002 that if you take into account prisoners who are excluded from poverty statistics and unemployment statistics, you know, thus masking the severity of racial inequality in the United States. But if you take into account prisoners, in the Chicago area, nearly 80% of working age African American men have criminal records, are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. You know, these men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste. A group of people defined largely by race who are relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, given this, you'd think this would be, you know, of urgent importance. Why not?
Yeah.
Why not? Well, I think to understand it, you have to go back and look at the history of how racial justice advocacy has been engaged in, you know, over the years, even dating back to the days of abolitionists. A primary strategy of racial justice advocates would be to identify those African Americans who defy racial stereotypes and hold them up as examples of people of great virtue and as examples of why the prevailing caste system is unjust and ought to be abandoned. Okay, so think Rosa Parks. You know, there were other people who refused to get up from their, you know, seat on the back of the bus, but did not become, you know, the face of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks was chosen for that role because she was considered a person of great virtue. You know, that she exemplified all that was good about the African American community. Civil rights leaders didn't want to choose someone who had been pregnant or whose father was an alcoholic. Anybody who had been in trouble in any way was considered not a suitable plaintiff. And we do the same thing today. You know, as a civil rights lawyer representing victims of racial profiling, what we used to do was screen people for criminal records. We wouldn't represent someone who had a criminal record. We would represent the doctors and the lawyers who had been stopped and searched, frisked on the side of the road. We'd represent the guy coming home from Iraq only to have his car dismantled in the search for drugs while his, you know, 6-year-old son was sitting in the back seat in tears. We would represent them because we knew that America would understand them as being respectable people, not deserving of abusive treatment at the hands of the police. But we didn't represent those who had criminal records. The people who were most harmed by this system never had their voices heard. I now believe that was a horrible, tragic mistake. Yeah. So for all of these years, the strategy for racial justice advocacy has been to create distance between those who are thought of as criminal, those who are thought of as being problematic in any way, to distance ourselves from them and shine a light on those who are considered the model citizens. But that strategy isn't going to work this time. It's not going to work this time. We are going to have to be willing to stand in solidarity with those people who have been demonized, despised, stereotyped, stigmatized in the most awful ways, and say they are deserving of our care, compassion, and concern. We are going to stand with them and stand up for them, and we're going to allow their stories and voices to be heard. And Hopefully this is a shift that civil rights organizations and our, black political leaders will be willing to make, but we can't wait for them to do it. We have to be willing to show that we will do it ourselves and stand up and speak out for those and create the kind of movement that will, require our political leaders to respond.
Yes. I was thinking of that powerful piece about Charles Blow in the New York Times just this last week. 500,000 young black brothers between 16 and 25 have undergone stop and frisk in the whole city. We talked earlier on the last panel about Brooklyn, when you were wonderful. In the whole city, 6% arrested. Now there's only 360,000 young black brothers between 16 and 25. 55% of those who were stopped were black, and over 30-some brown. Now you figure that kind of harassment, he calls it ethnic cleansing by means of intimidation, because black folk are leaving New York City in droves, especially young black folk. Now where are they going? I don't know. Jersey, Connecticut. It's not like you got a mass movement to Vermont, New Hampshire. Too cold up there, shit. But the point is, why is that not highlighted? Now, that has something to do with class. It has something to do with the new black middle class. It has something to do with a black leadership who is not attentive to what Jamal and Letitia are wrestling with in the hood of suffering, in the killing fields called poor communities. Everybody knows, of course, if this were happening to young white brothers and sisters in vanilla slices of the city, we'd be having a conference like this every week. If it hit the upper white middle class kids, conference every day. Every day. And it'd be subtle, delicate, highlighted, funded. But we also know if it were happening among black middle class brothers and sisters. I'm talking about the members of Jack and Jill. No, we love some Jack and Jill. Now we love our brothers. If it happened to black middle class young brothers and sisters, we'd have a different kind of black leadership. Because the distance, and this is what Brandon's hitting on, that's why this Princeton brother who puts this together, not solely because he has been intimidated, but because as in the process of becoming a medical doctor, he wants to remain connected with others who are suffering, like Chekhov. You want to be like Chekhov, medical doctor. Chekhov goes to Siberia and promotes prisoner reform while he's writing those short stories. That's what I see in Brother Brandon. But we don't have enough folk as they make their move into the new middle classes to make that kind of connection. That's what your text does, and it's such a wake-up call. It's a wonderful thing to see the sororities and the fraternities and the churches and the mosque and the synagogues in both black America as well as in the country as a whole respond to this wake-up call. But let me ask you this, what do you see as the major obstacles? Because in the age of Obama, where so many of the leaders, no matter what color, but those who think they're progressive, consider themselves such loyalists to him. And yet he himself and Brother Eric Holder, they can't even muster the courage to reauthorize the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Act. 4 years dangling. Doesn't take a lot of courage to do that. How many words have we heard about the prison industrial complex from the White House? The White House is public housing, just like the prisons. Two forms of public housing. Why are we obsessed with that public housing and end up downplaying the other? I think both are important now. But if I had my choice, I would want to accent those wrestling with the basement in our society, the underside, not those at the very, very top, even given the fact that it's a tremendous achievement. But when Americans believe that to be at the top is the fulfillment of King's dream, you got to tell them that's a lie. Barack Obama is not the achievement of King's dream. He's not. He is a fulfillment of King's dream. There's a qualitative difference between a fulfillment and the fulfillment, you see. what obstacles do you perceive in terms of not just black leadership, but especially progressive, liberal, centrist, non-Fox News-ish leadership?
Yes, well, I mean, I think there's a number of major challenges we've got to overcome, and part of it has to do with the veneer of color blindness that, encases this whole system of mass incarceration and allows so many people to kind of rationalize, the oppression of so many people in the United States today. That is really one of the main reasons I wrote the book, was to dispel so many of the myths that help to sustain this system. People need to understand, and they don't, that the war on drugs is not aimed at rooting out violent offenders or drug kingpins. Never has been. It's never been the primary focus of this drug war. Because this drug war was politically motivated and was not at all much concerned with actually reducing the rates of drug addiction or drug abuse. That has never been the primary concern. The way the war functions guarantees that millions are swept into the system for primarily, nonviolent, relatively minor drug offenses. Federal funding flows to those state and local law enforcement agencies that boost dramatically the sheer numbers of drug arrests. Law enforcement gets rewarded in cash for the sheer numbers of people swept into the system, branded criminals and felons, and then ushered into the undercast. But people don't understand that. People think the drug war must really be motivated out of concern about violent crime or drug kingpins. It's not true. Most people remain shocked when I tell them that people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. Most people have in their mind this idea of, black kid standing on the street corner with his pants sagging down. They think that's a drug dealer. Drug dealing happens in the hood. It happens everywhere else in America as well. Where the significant differences in the survey data can be found, it indicates that white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than black youth. Well, then why are prisons overflowing with black and brown drug offenders? The colorblind veneer of the system has made us blind to how severe racial bias permeates the system as a whole. But beyond that, I think you're absolutely right that people's love of Obama has also resulted in a demobilization of the black community at a time when we ought to be screaming about it. And, so many folks are afraid of hurting Obama. I don't want to hurt Obama. I don't want to add to his troubles by speaking up or speaking out. But Obama could wind up being a net loss for the African American community if we are not willing to hold him accountable. He asked us to. When he was elected, hold me accountable. And so, we have got to do what we can within our democracy to speak up and speak out and really mobilize. But we've also got to deal with the shame and stigma that affects poor communities of color today who've been hard hit by mass incarceration and keeps so many people silent and divided, blaming each other. There's this excellent ethnographic study that was done in Washington, D.C. It was published as a book called Doing Time on the Outside. It was a study of neighborhoods hardest hit by mass incarceration. I mean, these are neighborhoods where every apartment or every other house or apartment has a family member who's either currently behind bars or has just been released from prison. I mean, these are just neighborhoods where you just think everybody be talking about who's in, who's out, all the time. They couldn't find one person, not one, in these neighborhoods who had fully come out to their friends, to their neighbors, to their loved ones about their own criminal history or that of their loved ones. A young girl asked by her aunt, "Oh, where's your daddy?" "Oh, I don't know where my daddy is," knowing full well her daddy's in prison. People ask, "Oh, where's Uncle Troy? Where's Uncle Troy?" "Oh, Uncle Troy, yeah, he's out of town. He's out of town." "Oh, well, when will he be back?" Hard to say. Don't really know. Hard to say. People asked, "I haven't seen you for so long. Where have you been? Gosh, it must have been months, maybe years. Where have you been?" oh yeah, I've been caught up doing this, doing that, I gotta go. That shame and the stigma keeps us silent and divided. And the shame makes collective political action next to impossible. So I think we've got to start creating safe places in our churches, in our communities, in our schools where people feel safe talking about their own experiences, that of their loved ones, where people feel welcomed home when they return home from prison, not like they have to hide, deny, or avoid. Because until we're able to talk openly with one another, lovingly with one another about the tragedy that has occurred in our communities, we will not be able to do the kind of movement building work that is so desperately needed.
Wow, no, that's powerful. That's powerful. That's powerful. I think of the program there, Bradford, the Public Safety Initiative program, where you actually have visionary and courageous brothers who leave the prisons, go to the communities, and end up fighting crime that then becomes the image of the prisoner. So we're able to more readily stay in contact with the humanity and the ability to change and be transformed of he or she who has committed a crime. Which means, again, we need more relation between those of us outside of the bars and those behind the bars, so their voices can be heard. We can see their intelligence, their imagination, their courage, the ways in which they change, and the ways in which their destinies are inextricably linked to ours in that way. Because you said something, there's something in your book. When I read that line, I didn't know whether to say a prayer or have a cognac. You said, I actually did both, but we won't go into that. You said that the discourse of color blindness has led toward a blindness about the racial caste system. Think about that. The discourse of color blindness, which trivializes black suffering, brown suffering. It's a neoconservative, neoliberal construct. It was over against the claims about affirmative action, where the major terrain of battle was. But we know affirmative action really didn't affect most poor and working class brothers and sisters. Because you had to matriculate through the high school system, even to be be part of the pool to be chosen in affirmative action. You see. And affirmative action, I think, is still worth defending, but you recognize it has limits, severe limits. But the fact that there's colorblind, I think that's one of the things that's going to be important in terms of the waking of so many, because the neoconservative, neoliberal movement, intellectual, political, and so on, have been able to saturate the political landscape with color blindness, as if Martin Luther King talked about color blindness. Martin never used the term. Martin wanted us to be love-struck, not colorblind. Qualitative difference. Love-struck embodied. When you're love-struck, you're preoccupied with justice. How do you become a militant for tenderness? How do you become a fanatic for fairness? How do you become an extremist of love? That's Martin King. Colorblindness, let's strip all colors, all bodies, and just be equal. Now, how's that going to work? Meritocratic. Oh, your book begins to shatter that. But what other steps do you think we need to take in order to undermine it?
Well, you know, I do believe that color blindness has become an obstacle rather than a tool for racial equality. I mean, people say, oh, I'm colorblind, like that's some kind of virtue, when in fact it can be a form of cruelty. What you're saying is, I don't care enough to see you and your differences. I don't care enough to see your suffering in racial terms. I'm not even willing to really see you fully at all. I mean, when, colorblindness leads to initiatives where we refuse to even collect data on the race and ethnicity of people who are stopped and searched, or collect data about the race and ethnicity of people behind bars, so it becomes impossible even to see racial inequality. And then it becomes easier not to care about racial discrimination and bias and the suffering of people, of groups defined by race. So we do need to shift from this, rhetoric around blindness, which is really rhetoric about indifference. I am indifferent. You say, I don't care if he's black. You're saying, I don't care about you. I'm not willing to see your experience in racial terms, even if you do. Mm-hmm. And we've got to shift from that to one of care and concern. I care enough about you and your community to be able to see your suffering as a group as well as individually, and respond to it in a compassionate, loving, supportive way. So our rhetoric has got to change. Our language has got to change. I think we need to start abandoning certain terms. We should never call anyone ever again a felon. He's a felon. I'm a felon. That's got to end. This labeling of people, as I'm a felon. I can say I've told lies in my life. Does that make me a liar? I lied once, so now I'm a liar forever. I may even lie again. Does that make me a liar? Right? But that doesn't make me. We have to stop boxing people. Felony has become the new N-word. He's a felon. Now you have permission to treat that individual as though they're an animal, unworthy of any care or concern. Even terms like repeat offender, career criminal, those terms serve to mask the structures that create people cycling in and out of the prison system. If you're barred from jobs, if you're barred from public housing, if even food stamps are off limits to you, if you're saddled with hundreds or thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support, all of that, you're trying to survive. You're barred from the legal economy, and you commit a crime, and now you're a repeat offender. I think we have to change the language and the way we talk about each other and the folks within our communities so that we can begin to infuse even our discourse with one another with more care and concern about each other's well-being.
No, that's part of that legacy of Baldwin and Ella Baker and the others. I mean, what I loved about your book is the way in which you have such a universal vision that embraces all of humanity, but also a sensitivity to the distinctive histories of peoples who constitute the human family. And that's a very important connection and interplay that one has to have. Because, for example, I can understand why some white brothers and sisters might view color blindness as a form of progress, because after 244 years of white supremacist slavery and 90 years of white supremacist Jim Crow and Jane Crow, where the black body was associated with degradation and disgust, if a white brother comes up and says, I don't see your black body associated with disgust, I'm colorblind, they viewed it as a compliment, because that's moral movement. There's no longer disgust and degradation. You are bodiless or like me. Because as Brother Eddie says, the real subcode of colorblindness is whiteness. You're an extension of me. You one of us. Hey, you all right. Come on, Jamal. Come over to my house. Well, no. White brothers and sisters are human, precious. Black brothers and sisters are red, yellow, human, precious. Why does it have to be colorblind? You say when black folks see white brothers and sisters, they see white brothers and sisters. Now, why is that so? Because there's a long history in black people's struggles of staying in contact with the humanity of white brothers and sisters, even when they hate us, even when they murder us, even when they trash us. We say, we know you're a human being, you just acting like a gangster. There's a long history of that. And part of the sense of urgency, which is tied both to the suffering of those in prison, but also in terms of the future of democracy, because your book raises the fundamental question that every generation must wrestle with if democracy at its best is to survive, if one's going to reinvigorate and renew democracy. And that question is, what is the relation between public interest and the weak and the vulnerable? Every generation has to raise that question. It could be tied to orphans. It could be tied to widows. It could be tied to Catholics or Jews or Arabs or Muslims or gay brothers and lesbian sisters or workers or poor. But the exemplary group, the litmus test, even given the vicious suffering of our red brothers and sisters, indigenous peoples, the litmus test of American democracy has always been, how you going to deal with those who's been enslaved, Jim Crow'd, hated, despised, subjugated, and then given a compliment saying, I'm looking at you through colorblind lens. See? And that's why you say the very meaning of race tied to the meaning of democracy is connected with dismantling this racial caste system. And what would be, you think, the first steps in a practical way?
Well, you know, like I said, I firmly believe nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of...
Like Madison, like Indianapolis, like Columbus, Ohio.
Yes, you know, I mean, I think it's mind-boggling the scale of this system. You know, if we were to go back to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement really kicked off, we'd have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. 4 out of 5.
Wow.
You know, 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system could lose their jobs. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white, rural communities. Many of those communities have been promised far more benefits than prisons actually delivered to those communities. But nonetheless, many of those communities still feel dependent on prisons as part of their economic base. Those prisons across America would have to close down. Prison guard unions, which were discussed earlier, you know, among the largest and most powerful political organizations in many states. Those prison guard unions would have to just walk off the job. Private prison companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange, forced to watch their profits just vanish. You know, this system is now so deeply rooted in our economic, political, and social structure that it is not going down without a major fight, a dramatic upheaval, a major shift in our public consciousness.
Wow.
So, you know, how do we get this going? Well, you know, the work has already begun. There are people all around the country that have been engaged in work that has been planting the seeds of movement building for a long, long time. So it's not as though we're starting from scratch. There are people who've been doing great work for a long, long time. But I think what's needed now is a lot of consciousness raising and public education. You know, we have really got to dispel the myths that sustain the system and the stigma and shame that keeps us quiet and divided and blaming one another. We have really got to awaken those who are committed to racial justice in the United States so that they are inspired and compelled to put ending mass incarceration at the top of their agendas. And so that folks who are hardest hit by mass incarceration come to recognize they have a voice. They have a voice that ought to be heard, and space is made for those voices to be heard, so that there's a great rumbling across the nation as more and more people begin to speak up, speak out, take responsibility for educating each other, educating those in their church, educating those in their own schools, in their communities, within their families, so that these conversations begin to take place in a way that causes a grand awakening within our society. And then we've got to get busy organizing, really organizing. And I'm not talking about piecemeal policy reform here. I'm not talking about tinkering with this system here and there. Oh, you know, here's one police practice that we can try to tweak a little bit if we, you know, get the right people at the table. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying, you know, we need to start thinking, what does it take to end mass incarceration as we know it? To end the whole thing. We've got to put drug prohibition on the table. You know, the war on drugs has been the engine of mass incarceration. You know, and we've got to start talking about, does it make sense for us to be criminalizing drug use in this country? You know, during the 1990s, the period of the greatest increase in mass incarceration, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession. You know, a drug less harmful than alcohol or tobacco. and at least as prevalent in middle-class white communities and on college campuses as it is in the hood. But we have spent billions, in fact, now more than $1 trillion waging this drug war for going on 40 years now, and drug abuse, drug addiction rates have remained largely unchanged. $1 trillion that could have been channeled into our schools, into job creation. Absolutely. So we have got to be willing to think much bigger and bolder than we have to date, and do the hard work of organizing for a movement to end mass incarceration, not just, isolated efforts to tinker with the system as it is.
Yeah. Oh, indeed. I know we want to open it up for questions, queries. Do not hesitate.
Hello, I'm Lindsay, and I just have to say it's so thrilling to be here.
Stand up, everybody can see your beautiful self.
Okay, fine. I just want to say it's thrilling to be here, not just with you guys, I mean, that goes without saying, but just everybody here. I think you all are doing an amazing justice, not just to yourselves, but the society at large, being here. So I wanted to make a comment and then kind of a question. It's interesting that you guys start talking about the whole, idea of colorblindness. I have lots of integrated friends, and they always say, I'm colorblind. And I'm like, well, please keep in mind that blindness is a handicap. Mm-hmm. Just think about that, and I think, a lot of times, like you said, they want to pat themselves on the back, but they're really just kind of incriminating themselves, because to be colorblind, you have to first acknowledge that you are lacking something. Mm. So just to to kind of talk about the whole Jim Crow thing, one of the struggles that I have as a black woman, obviously not to make this too personal, but the whole, dating thing. My job is to keep my family together, and the idea of the black family. Now, my personal dating pool is wide. I never restricted myself as it came to race, but I find a lot of, my colleagues, friends who are in the same position as I am feel like they need to withhold themselves. They're being patriotic by not dating outside of their race. But at the same time, there's this huge conversation about remaining single forever. And there's this other conversation happening where the black family is the front line of keeping our boys and our girls out of prison. But if we can't keep that family together, and we're being given these mixed messages about who we should be dating and what we should be putting up with for the sake of the family, what message is someone supposed to take? Is it supposed to be this, kumbaya thing, or should we be, like I said, keeping ourselves for these young men who, like you said, are not necessarily viable in terms of my education and my position that I've worked so hard to acquire, and you guys have, kind of fallen, in the cracks. Like, what do I do? Sorry to give you that question, but I've been wondering for a long time.
Are you asking who you should date? In a way, yes. I think it's difficult. I'm glad my dad dated outside the race, or I might not be here today. So, I think that it's an intensely personal question, who you date and why. My own sense is that, the best thing that we can do, in our personal lives and within our communities is to really come from a place of love. Right? So, in making decisions about who you partner with, as well as who you care for or tutor in the schools, and who you include as part of your, nuclear or extended family, it should all really be coming just from a place of love. And I would be hard-pressed to tell you that, in service to the goal of, creating stronger black families, that you shouldn't open your heart to people outside of your race. Now, what can we do to help support black families and black men coming home from prison or heading off to prison maintain relationships with their loved ones? There's a lot that can be done. There's a lot can be done. So we can think about how do we provide better support to men and women returning home from prison so that they can reunify with their partners. It doesn't help if you're living in public housing and you face eviction if you allow, your child's father to come home and reunite and live with you. You're barred from public housing when you first return home from prison. That's keeping families apart. It divides families. Today, if you're back on your child support payments, you can be charged with a felony in many states. There's now men who, haven't been able to pay their child support coming out of prison. Few months go by and they find themselves hit with child support, orders and find themselves caught up, branded criminals and felons for not paying child support. We need to think about how the policies that we have put into place actually operate to divide families and communities and work, to ensure that children are able to maintain relationships with their parents if they're behind bars, that there's more connections sustained. People aren't shipped, hundreds or thousands of miles away in prison, but are, able to stay closer to home. All of those things can help sustain families within the context of mass incarceration, but ultimately we should be ending this system as a whole to ensure that we don't have this phenomenon of, in large urban areas of most black men acquiring criminal records and finding it difficult to sustain partnerships and families. That's the ultimate goal. But what personal decisions you make in the meantime?
I'm joking.
I say just keep loving.
Neil Frank, first of all, I want to There we go. Okay. First, I want to thank you for continuing to talk about the war on drugs. And I just want to set this foundation for this question real quick. With over 3 decades in law enforcement, if there's one thing I know, it's how to target individual people and to stay away from certain neighborhoods as we go about locking people up. And I spent most of that time in narcotics enforcement, so I know what it's all about. I know about the engine that you spoke to that is driving this whole thing, whether we're talking about the prison industrial complex or how we can't finance or properly fund our schools. We have to stop the train before we can head in another direction. Can you talk a little bit more about the mechanics of the movement? What would need to be done? What you see as far as getting this movement going, who's involved, how we involve them, just a little bit more about the framework and the structure of that movement so that when these young people here have that opportunity to move this train in the other direction, they'll know where and how to partake and that it's absolutely necessary for them to partake.
Yes, good question. Good question.
Wonderful question.
Well, there are so many different forms that movement building can take, so many different ways that people can contribute. And so, it's difficult to say, here's the recipe or here's the roadmap for everybody in the room to follow. Artists have a contribution to make to the movement. Students have a contribution. People within law enforcement have a contribution to make. There's, countless ways in which people can make a contribution to the movement. So what I'll say, instead of providing a roadmap or kind of outlining 2 things that I think are critically important for people to keep in mind. Like I said, one is consciousness raising. So you need to ask yourself, how do I, in whatever community I'm a part of, go about raising the consciousness within the community that I'm a part of? So here we have someone who demonstrated beautifully one example about how you can go about consciousness raising within a university community. But it shouldn't stop here on Princeton's campus, right? Now the question is, how do we make sure that this conversation happens in a lot of different classrooms, in a lot of different settings, within different student groups? How do we ensure that there's movement happening within this campus around these issues? It could be around financial aid policies. It could be around, taking a look at, what is Princeton's policies? I don't know, with respect to people who have prior convictions and are applying. Is Princeton University invested in any funds that also fund the Correctional Corporation of America? And if so, we should disinvest. So there's all sorts of ways that students can begin to get together, raise consciousness, and begin to build that movement for mass incarceration. It can happen in churches. If you're a member of a church, ask yourself, how do I begin to form a study group, a book club that studies books on this subject? How do I get a forum in my church? Whatever community or circle you're a part of, ask yourself, how can I contribute and get this conversation started? The other thing I would just add is that, and I'll tell a story in connection with this, we have got to shift away from mere rule shifting to transformational change. Okay? And there's a difference. There's a difference. And in fact, Dr. King, at the end of his life, gave a speech to advocates, racial justice advocates, saying, we've got to understand the difference between a reform movement and a revolutionary movement, right? And he was about creating a revolution of caring within the United States, which would affect our political system, our economic system, all of our systems. We have to understand what's the difference between tinkering and transformation. Now, there's this great article actually called Bleeding Heart, which I recommend to everyone to read. It's actually written by a man, Tom Stoddard, who is the former director of Lambda in New York. He was advocating for gay rights in New York City in the 1990s, and he was depressed because they had been fighting for 10 years for just a simple anti-discrimination ordinance in New York City that would protect the rights of gays and lesbians. And they fought over and over again, year after year, trotting people out, telling their stories of discrimination and humiliation and attacks that people had suffered just because of their sexual orientation. And year after year, this had gone on, and they had kept losing and losing, and he was discouraged. And then he was invited to attend a conference in New Zealand, and he was thrilled, because New Zealand at that time was the only country that already outlawed discrimination against gays and lesbians. It was a country that already allowed gays and lesbians to serve openly in the military, and he thought to himself, I cannot wait to get to New Zealand to see what this nirvana is like for gays and lesbians. And he gets there, and he's stunned to discover that the culture, the climate in New Zealand, it was actually more homophobic and hostile to gays and lesbians than back in New York City. And he thought to himself, how can I possibly explain this? What he was asking everyone in New Zealand, why is this the case? You have all the laws we are working tirelessly for, back home, and yet you have that here and it's worse. Well, it turns out that in New Zealand, they were able to achieve rule changes. They were able to, amend the existing civil rights laws to include sexual orientation without any public discussion. It happened kind of behind closed doors. Some good progressive legislators made the changes, but there was no gay rights movement, no public fight, no movement, no engagement around the big issues. There had been no fight. And so he concludes his article by saying he was so grateful that they had spent 10 years losing in New York City, because what they had won was this major shift in public consciousness, a cultural transformation that made New York City a much safer and more welcoming place for gays and lesbians than in New Zealand. And so he just lays out this framework. Advocates need to identify, especially if they're advocating on behalf of a stigmatized population. They need to ask themselves, am I seeking just mere rule changes? Or am I seeking cultural transformation? A shift in the way we regard a group of people and the level of caring we have about them. And if what we are aiming for is cultural transformation, then nothing less than a major movement will do that engages the public in the struggle and in the debate and kind of smokes out the opposition. As Dr. King would take, the movement to the places of fiercest resistance to dramatize the moral dimensions of the struggle. And so we have got to be willing to wage these battles in a way where we're not looking just for the quickest, easiest victories, but we're willing to kind of stake a position and fight openly over and over and over again until we achieve the cultural transformation that will sustain a far more compassionate political, social, and economic system in the United States.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes. Professor West, Professor Alexander, thank you for this rich dialogue. My question is directed to either of you, but it emerges out of the work of your colleague Paul Butler in his upcoming book, it may be out now, entitled Let's Get Free, A Hip-Hop Theory of Justice. And in the text, he argues that for his law school students to graduate, and he's at George Mason, but for his students to graduate and to assume positions as federal prosecutors or state prosecutors further complicates and adds to the problem. So he admonishes his students right now, he says, not to take those positions, because to do so is to lend their talents and their skills and their tools to what he argues is an ongoing criminal enterprise, namely the prison system. So I just want to know what your opinion is on that, and what can be done at the pedagogical level in the law schools, that place that shapes the minds of the attorneys and the judges and the advocates. What can be done on that level as part of the prong to address the problem? And how are you being received at law schools when you, I'm sure on the lecture circuit, dealing with this text? Thank you.
Yes. Paul Butler has written a great book, Let's Get Free, and he has a whole chapter. I think the title of it is, Should Good People Be Prosecutors? And he argues that the answer is no, and he's a former prosecutor and argues no, that good people should not be prosecutors because there are so few opportunities to do good within the system. And when good people become prosecutors, they lend credibility to the system as a whole and help to immunize it from critique and from challenge. The more good people are in those positions, but doing things that are extremely harmful, the less likely it is people, in his view, will understand the system as being fundamentally flawed. My husband is a prosecutor, so, you can imagine we have some differences of opinion about some things. This is actually a debate that we have. He argues that, you really need good police, good prosecutors, people who are going to exercise their discretion wisely, and even though they may not have a lot of room to maneuver within within the constraints that exist, you want good people in those positions. I myself would never be a prosecutor, and I think I'm probably more in Paul's camp than in my husband's on that one. And I think that the scale of change that needs to occur requires people working from outside of the system, organizing to put overwhelming pressure on the system itself and eventually dismantle it. So, I'm grateful that there are some good prosecutors out there exercising their discretion wisely. But in terms of movement building, I would never argue that everyone who's interested in reforming the system sign up to be a prosecutor. I think that there are far better ways to make a contribution to ending mass incarceration than joining the system in that way. In law schools, I think, this is a discussion that is belated and, so much of the conversation about criminal law in law schools is divorced from the political and social context from which the cases emerge. When you read a case in a law school, textbook, you won't learn most likely the race of the individual involved, anything about their circumstances of the case. You just read an opinion, usually an appellate opinion, that describes very select facts about a case, and it contains reasoning about why usually the defendant isn't going to walk, and that their claims are invalid. But there's very little of the larger social political context, very little discussion about mass incarceration, how it came to be, unless you're in a specialized seminar that focuses specifically on those issues. And so I think one of the things that needs to change within legal education is providing far more political and social context in those first year classes about criminal law and criminal procedure, so that students don't graduate from law school having no understanding about why it is we have the world's largest prison population that's bursting in, it seems, with poor black and brown folks. And yet I think most people graduating from law school today don't much have a clue about how it is that we got to this point in time.
What do you think critical legal studies and critical race studies, critical gender studies, critical sexual orientational studies is a way of doing that?
Absolutely, but I think it needs to occur outside of isolated seminars where 18 students who are already very receptive to the message come to a small seminar. It needs to be integrated into the first year core curriculum that all students are exposed to.
I think part of the problem is, to be a professional, in a certain sense, is to sharpen but narrow the mind. So it sharpens the skills, so you're highly technical, but it decontextualizes, so it doesn't give you the larger, rich context. And the result is you end up with waves of professionals who are well adjusted to injustice, but very smart. And well adapted to indifference, but very smart. You see, it's like Social Network, the film. Who's going to be the smartest in the room? But no compassion, no commitment to justice, no social skills in terms of treating people decently, and ending up well adjusted to injustice and locked into a spiritual malnutrition and moral constipation. Now, that's in part what professionalization does. Now, I'm still pro-professionalization because you want smart folk. But smartness is idolatrous if it's not tied to something deeper. Spirit, heart, justice, love, compassion, care, that ethic of care that shot through every chapter in your text. It's a beautiful thing to see.
Yes, thank you. I'm Aaron Smith. I'm representing the community in schools of Philadelphia and also the Freedom Schools of Philadelphia. Dr. West, first, it's a pleasure to see you again. I haven't seen you since you spoke at Palmer Seminary in Pennsylvania, though I have seen you speak with my mentor, Dr. Asante, on YouTube, and it's a pleasure to see you in person and not just online. I was presenting research last week on the effects of miscarriages on African American men at the NCBS conference where I got the pleasure to meet your sister, and I told her I'd be coming here and I'd try to get to talk to you. We at the Freedom School have chosen this book to put in the hands of all of our young people. We're involved in 64 schools in the city, and we're involved in 13 different locations and chapters, and every student will get this information this summer.
Every one of them.
I'm involved in different circles in my community. I'm going to bring it to my church, where Pastor James Hall is pastor of Triumph Baptist Church, my fraternity, Phi Beta Sigma, the Lodge. I'm in more circles than the Olympic symbol, and I'm evangelizing without ceasing. My Facebook status right now, you'll see this book and not my face. So if anybody wants to do that, I think that's a great idea, to change your Twitter and change your Facebook status. We're in the process of developing a curriculum right now. I know that people will know by looking at you that you have a family. We service K through 12. Now, for the older kids, it's a lot easier. They can relate to it. They've gone through some similar experiences that the brother described earlier. Now, as a mother, I just need you to help to inform us as we develop this curriculum. How do we bring this information, some of which is sensitive and some of which is fairly complex, to our youngest scholars, our kindergartners and our first graders? How do we introduce the topic? How do we introduce this information to them? Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and I'm actually working it out within my own family right now. I have an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old, and trying to talk to them about my work, my book, why I'm flying around talking to different audiences, why I feel it's so important that I do so, and what it's all about is extremely difficult. You know, I start from the premise that what's most important is for everyone to be treated with fairness, dignity, love, and respect. And unfortunately, that isn't true for all people in the United States. You know, and how you talk about this obviously depends on how young or old, but I'm talking now for, you know, my 6-year-old boy who scared me to death one day when he brought a water gun to the mall with him and whipped it out and pretended he was shooting a police car as it drove by. And, you know, I snatched him and, you know, went off on him out of just panic, thinking, you know, my God, you know, he was 5 at the time, you know, you could have just gotten yourself shot. I didn't know you had that little green water gun on you, you know. And it forced me to sit down and try to talk with him about why it's not funny, why that's not a game, why, because he's a young black man, he may face risks that he ought not to, and that others in his school or his community may not. And I think it's difficult because you don't want to scare young children, but you owe them the truth. And so depending on the age, introducing them to the truth as delicately as you can, depending on their age, and always, you know, reinforcing it with the message of how much they are worth. You know, the message has to be, you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, and you deserve to be treated with kindness. We all do. This system, unfortunately, doesn't treat all of us in those ways. And, you know, that's what this is about, making sure that all of us are treated with the kind of dignity and kindness and respect that we, you know, deserve. I think if you just come at it with telling young people how bad things are, or, you know, it can actually reinforce suspicions of inferiority or unworthiness. And so, you know, the data and the facts and the practices have to be coupled with a reinforcing message about their own worth and value and their own power, you know, their ability to be part of a movement for change or a solution to the problems we face.
Good afternoon. I asked this question as one who was born and raised in the hood when they used to call it the ghetto of the 70s and 80s, and before the age of 18 had friends who were either incarcerated or killed. I had the good fortune of teaching college courses now Monday through Friday, teaching racism and sexism and religion, and preaching on Sundays. Having broken the poverty, the cycle of poverty in one generation with a son who was a graduating senior at Princeton University, how do we inform and empower the black middle class who are not in the academy or in church to participate in this process, who at times find themselves having one foot in the ghetto and one foot in the suburbs? I was wondering how we do that.
Well, I think I don't think it's going to be easy for the reasons that, you know, I stated earlier. I think that there has been, you know, an impulse to distance oneself from those who are considered, you know, the criminal element. And, you know, I think you can see patterns within the black middle class. It's not new to, you know, this period in time. I mean, Du Bois talked about it. You have that the class divisions within the black community have been problematic for a long time. And for those who aren't part of a church or other kinds of organizations where they might be reached, you know, we have to rely on other, you know, means of reaching them. You know, whether it's through social media and circulating, you know, videos and things like that, which can be informing them, inspiring. If it's trying to, you know, get BET and other forms of media that, you know, actually do reach these communities to be more responsible and include, you know, politically relevant, you know, information in a way that could actually reach those audiences. You know, I think more effort could be made to do so. But I think it's going to have to take a creative kind of public education and outreach strategy, and efforts are going to have to be made to reach those folks through a wide variety of means, including through word of mouth, so that when we're having talks with friends, neighbors, family members, as part of our regular life, if you are part of the black middle class, that it's part of the conversation you have with those you come into contact with, and you're constantly encouraging people to seek out information, to educate themselves, to re-examine their patterns of thought and their relationship to the so-called underclass or caste.
I mean, just quickly, I think it has something to do, though, with the fact that we need more middle-class brothers and sisters who have a genuine respect for the intelligence of poor people.
Yes.
A genuine respect for those Sly Stone called everyday people, or James Cleveland called ordinary people. And what I mean by that is, it's a beautiful thing to see the National Mentoring Program, for example, of Susan Taylor. Or my own brothers, the Alphas, or we figure the Kappas, or the AKA and the Deltas. They all have mentoring programs. What does that mean? It means you get black bourgeois folk who invest themselves in precious young people who are poor, and therefore they get a sense of what their lives are really like. So you actually have a relationship. Because you ask most young people who their mentors are, they say, Oprah Winfrey. No, she's not your mentor. You don't know her. She's on TV. She can inspire you, but she's not your mentor. Your mentor is somebody you got to connect with. So you get cross-class. But when you get social movements, it's not led by the lawyers. It's not led by the politicians. It's not even led by most of the doctors, unfortunately. But this doctor going to be different, of course. But you see what I mean? It comes from below. See, Martin had to learn that. Those everyday people in Montgomery got something to say, even though he got that PhD, and he loved them enough to listen. See what I mean? And so the challenge becomes then the role of the artist. We got Imani Perry right here, Prophets of the Hood. We're going to talk about hip-hop tomorrow. We got a conference on hip-hop tomorrow. Y'all know that, right? We're going to throw down on that. Cynthia Biggs written another powerful text. She's also an artist herself, writing for the Stylistics and Jones Girls and so forth. Why? Because the art is one space where people actually do have a genuine respect for the intelligence of poor folk. Mm-hmm. Who's going to deny the genius of Louis Armstrong? Mm-hmm. But he ain't got no PhD. Who gives a damn? John Coltrane. We can go on and on. Luther, Aretha, and so forth and so on. So that there's ways in which black middle-class folk can be humbled. I'm not saying to give up your commitment to skills and education, but you need to be humbled and understand that it's a lie if you think that somehow you got a monopoly on the insight. That's a lie. And that's a process of being maturing, of growing up. We need more middle-class folk who grow up. The new Jim Crow is a text of growing up, because it's an awakening of thinking, well, maybe if we change the rules, it would work. No, self-critique. We got to call for a movement. It's more than that. And this is the time for it. Why? Because Cairo, Egypt, and Tunisia, and Bahrain, and Yemen, and Libya, those are not jokes. These are democratic awakenings in the northern part of Africa, in the way South Africa began to generate democratic lessons with Nelson Mandela and Billy Nair and Joe Slovo and a whole host of others. That's the democratic waves, and that's what we're looking for, and that's what that last chapter, the fire this time, is all about. And I think that we have a real chance at it. And Brother Brandon, to pull this thing off with Sister Jen and the others at Princeton, to be part of this wave. And you got it all on tape, right? No, that's very important. We want it to get out, especially those panels with all those new voices, younger generation voices. Because when you say ghetto, that's my generation. I'm old school. That's Donny Hathaway, brother. You see? But the hood is something else. But we got to listen to the folk in the hood, but we got some ghetto insights too. Even if we're at Princeton.
And
it's another kind of ghetto, but we won't get into that right
now. And we have our last question.
Yeah, this is on thank you
so much. So you mentioned Ben Chaney. He had to leave, but he heads the James Chaney Foundation.
Yes.
And he's starting an initiative on national truth and reconciliation, talking about activists. I think it's so important about your focus on a mass movement. But I wanted to ask you a question about collective trauma, because the people you mention went out in a very painful and difficult way as our inspiration. And I wonder, because we see that if we weren't old enough to live through it, when we watch Eyes on the Prize Part 2, or Brandon started by talking about Fred Hampton, right? So there are advocates and there are activists. So what is the relationship of advocates to activists, particularly those who end up on the so-called front line and who can lose their jobs, be kicked out of school, be beaten by police, right? And unfortunately exit prematurely and violently? And what is our mandate for protection within our desire to love?
Well, that's a profound question. I'm glad that's the last one. Did you want to say something on me out there?
Well, I think what you're really speaking to is that in building a movement, it's going to require a great deal of sacrifice. And there are going to be some people who are willing to make greater sacrifices than others. And, as I understand your distinction between an activist and an advocate, an activist is someone who is willing to make great sacrifices and put themselves at considerable risk. One of the critiques I have in the last chapter of my book is how the civil rights movement became professionalized and divorced from the people it claimed to represent. And in many respects, being a civil rights lawyer or civil rights advocate became a career rather than, a commitment to a movement. And I think what's necessary is for those who are advocates to be willing to support in very tangible ways those who are activists and actually begin to envision themselves more as activists rather than mere advocates for policy reform. And so I would respond just by saying that it's my hope that in building this movement we will have fewer people who think of themselves merely as advocates, as professional tinkerers with the system, and more people who view themselves as activists for justice who are willing to make great sacrifices and take considerable risks. And, the role that civil rights lawyers and other advocates can have is to swooping in to the defense of those who find themselves arrested or forced out of their jobs and to fight for them as they struggle, even at great risk to themselves or to their families.
Yeah, I think yes, absolutely. I think that there's no doubt that what's going on? What's going on? Well, let me answer this question, though, brother.
He's not finished.
Let me answer this question, though, brother. Oh, you talking about that book? Your book? No, sir. Oh, okay. Well, let everybody know you got a book and it's a good book. Okay. Show everybody your book. Okay, that's wonderful. God bless you. Oh, I know. I think we got the last question, though, brother. Though, but I'm just glad I know you wrote that book. The thing is this: there is no movement without persons who are willing to live and die for it. Yeah. Every movement around the world against the powers that be, against capital, against white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobic powers, anti-Semitic, anti-Arab. It's fertilized by the blood of the martyrs. And part of the reason why we haven't had expression of the righteous indignation and holy anger and moral outrage is because most leaders are up for sale.
Yes.
They're subject to the highest bidder. That's the difference between Martin and Malcolm and Fannie Lou and Ella Baker. They were never up for sale. Even if you disagreed with them, they were not up for sale. But in our thoroughly commercialized, commodified society, when they look at what the prospects are for actually overcoming the powers that be, they say life's too short. I'm up for sale. I don't want to tell the full truth. That's the reason why Mumia Abu-Jamal is a free man on death row. He still tells the truth as he understands it. In that sense, he's much freer than Barack Obama could ever be. Because the Oval Office is a kind of golden cage. You can't tell the truth there. You can wield power, but you can't tell the full truth because of structural constraints. That's true for any politician, any color. Let me see. That's the difference of those who came before, which means what? Which means that this new wave, especially young folk, you've got to have a Sankofa mentality, right? You can't move forward without looking backward and recognizing that you need what? You need to be spiritually fortified. Because nobody wants to die for something unless you love something. And if you don't have a deep love for it, then get out of the way. If you're not morally courageous, if you're not politically determined, you're not going to have a movement. You're going to have an incorporation strategy. See what I mean? And incorporation has its role. I'm here at Princeton, right? But at the same time, I know I'll never sell out while I'm here. I'll tell the truth until the day I'm with the worms. Why? Because those who came before mean so much. And I've decided to be with the next wave, with the younger generation. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about that last chapter of this classic, of this intellectual freedom fighter. Sister Michelle Alexander, give her a hand, give her a hand, give her a hand. Yes, give her a hand. Indeed, it's blessed to have you at Princeton. We love you too, just like we love the prisoners. Yes, we love our poor people and working people. We love all of them. Oh yes, indeed, 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 indeed. What a blessing. What a blessing.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone again for staying with us today. I'd most definitely like to thank again our keynote speakers. If we join another round of applause. I hope that today's conference hasn't just been about talking, but about action. I think that each and every one of us have now become new leaders who aren't constrained in that public domain of the White House or of, in a lot of cases, the justice system. So now we are equipped with the knowledge of how to change it. And in our first panel, we saw kind of the historical elements or the historical rise of the prison system and how it began to take on a black face after the 1970s, becoming something that was not about keeping justice in a sense, but keeping order. And there's a very different sense between the two when one wants to try to create a racial order instead of a system of justice for all Americans. Both Professor Carla Shedd and Professor Brown Dean supplemented this history by highlighting how the prison system didn't just become colorized, but was also genderized. Women are now, as was reported in our study, making up more than 75% of new incarcerees. That's a staggering figure that's not just separating our families in the sense that we're not birthing new people into our generation, but those who are already there and are being nurtured and brought up in the society to feel that they have worth or that they have love. And that's something that has to be corrected. What does this history mean for us? How can we take what we've learned here today and apply it to our own lives? We're not in jail, we're not incarcerated, but that doesn't mean that this history and this prerogative and this narrative that we've talked about today doesn't affect each and every one of us. Professor Brown Dean highlighted how even as citizens, the rights of blacks were being taken away, but still their bodies were used in order to bring financial support to states or in order to benefit rural societies. Our citizenship isn't being taken away, and our bodies are here. So how can we use our citizenship and our ability to be involved in the justice system and in the political system in order to make the change and be the voice for those individuals and those prisoners who don't have a voice or can't utilize the voice that they have been born with? Professor James talks about how we can leave the museum that we've been refined to and defined to by engaging in a revolutionary struggle and a political protest, and how the two don't have to be different. To do so, Professor Smith stresses that we need to wake up from our complacency and that we have to combat the support for criminalization that has come from the silent majority within our own ranks. We ourselves are divided, not only as individuals who are supporting the justice system and who aren't, but those who are maintaining it for their own economic purposes. Professor Alexander talked about how the issue of the justice system is not just an issue of race, but also an issue of economics. Whose interests are being at play? Is it the interest for equality and humanity, or for somebody in the non-ghetto parts of Princeton University in order to keep their society sustained? How are we affecting our families? How are our young people being affected? There are young people today who are being conditioned to think that their future is to live in a jail. There are young people today who are playing in playgrounds in Bed-Stuy that ask them to play cops and robbers because that's the only future that they have in mind. That's the only future that believably they can obtain. If we want to combat the future of these jail playgrounds that Professor Shedd discusses, we have to address both the situations in prison and those that are facing people who are attempting to get out. The issue is not just in our prisons now, but in the inability that those who leave prison have to be re-entrants or to be readmitted into society. Professor Alexander talked about the second-class citizenship that former, and I don't want to use the word felons, but former inmates have been subjected to. Not only have they been labeled and cast aside, but they have now been degraded and dehumanized. Sounds a lot like the Jim Crow era, doesn't it? How can we continue to defeat this racial caste that's been alluded to by Professor Alexander? Though we can't see the issues of imprisonment as colorblind, we can solve the problem with all colors, all ages, and all genders. Just because this is an issue that is affecting, in majority, only one color of society doesn't mean that it's an issue that has to be addressed by that same stagnated level of society. Everyone can answer this question. Everyone can be involved in this fight. And as Professor Alexander alluded to again, this can't be a reforming, it has to be a revolution. Though to revolutionize the system, there's a need to, 1, improve consciousness, and 2, to begin organizing. We must now be conscious not just of our place in society, but of our place in changing that society. We need to have a vision of where we would like to be and where we are now. How can we change? How can we improve? And how can we grow? Everyone is needing for that because everyone has a role. Whether you're an educator, whether you're a student, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a parent, whether you're a family member, you all have a role and you all have a contributing part to this society. I'd like to leave you with a quote from one of our audience members, which was via Martin Luther King. Whatever affect one directly infects all indirectly. I can never be what I want to be until you are all what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. Let us face our reality by recognizing that what one is, we all are. Okay, so I know you've heard his name a lot during the start of this conference, but I just wanted to take a little time to congratulate the person who ended up making this a reality.
Yes.
If Brandon Bell could please stand, turn around.
Brandon, yeah. Brother Brandon, yeah. Indeed.
This is where the vision starts, but it doesn't have to be where it ends. Thank you.
Don't go. Let's hear what Brandon got to say now.
I'll make this quick because I know it's Friday night.
I forgot about this part. You do yours because I have to stand.
I hope that today was as enlightening for you as it was for me. What we were just a part of here today should not be forgotten after you walk through those doors. This conference should only be the beginning of the conversation, the next step on the much too long path to bringing an end to the issues discussed by our speakers. The fact that so many of you sit before me this evening is proof of the importance that these imprisonment issues hold and the fact that we are ready to bring an end to them to heal our communities. We are all here because we sought education. And as Malcolm X once said, education is the passport to the future. And it must start at an early age. The educational systems in our communities are lacking. And as a result, our youth suffer. They become victims of circumstance placed on a direct path into these prisons. And this is what we must bring to an end. We spend more and more money towards imprisoning our Americans every year, while at the same time, schools in lower income neighborhoods consistently face budget cuts. So I ask you all, where are our priorities? Is it that we're more concerned with putting our youth behind bars than we are with putting them behind school desks? How do we expect them to know anything but crime if we don't first give them the opportunity to learn something else? The boy born into a single-parent home on the wrong side of the train tracks didn't ask to be in his position. College is but a myth to him growing up, so instead he turns to petty crime to support his family. And then he ends up a victim of the very system that raised him. The imprisonment issue is an epidemic that is fed by our own neglect. Our neglect to acknowledge the fact that our condition will not improve on its own. It is our own complacency with the diminishing state of our communities across the nation that has brought what once was a great civil rights progression to what seems to be a standstill. We once utilized imprisonment as a way to use the system against itself in order to make civil rights history. Now it is slowly fragmenting our families, our communities, and our country as a whole. This is the time to bring change. However, that change will not come to those who wait for it. We have to actively seek it, and we have to actively fight for it. Large-scale conversations such as these should be ongoing, for improvement is a gradual process, and in it, we each have to play a role. Whether big or small, it is our obligation to ourselves, to our children, and to the future of our great nation to see that it gets done. We cannot put the weight of this struggle on the backs of a few. In order for us to achieve the ultimate goal, we must equally partake in the fight, and it is then and only then that we will see the light of success. I now conclude you by leaving you with one of my favorite quotes, someone who has been far under-mentioned in this conference. It's from Malik El-Haj Malik El-Shabazz, a.k.a. Malcolm X. He says, "There is no better than adversity. Every defeat, every heartbreak, every loss contains its own seed, its own lesson on how to improve your performance the next time." Well, we've endured centuries of heartbreak and many a loss, but we are not defeated. We must take these lessons learned from adversity and use them to finally improve our present condition for good. So let's take these powerful words and put them to good use. I'd like to again thank all of our sponsors, the Center for African American Studies, our panelists, the entire Princeton University community, you, the audience, and specifically I'd like to thank my mother, Darlene Dennis, for without her, none of us would be here right now. Thank you again.